Somewhere, on somebody's phone, there is a photograph of me standing completely alone at the end of an aisle, in a wedding dress, holding a bouquet of white peonies that were shaking hard enough that a few loose petals had already fallen onto the runner beneath my shoes. I'm looking at a set of double doors. The doors never opened. 140 guests sat behind me, close enough that I could hear someone's chair creak every time they shifted. A string quartet, not knowing what else to do, just kept playing softer and softer, the same 8 bars looping, until someone finally walked over and told them to stop. I have never seen that photograph myself. I've only been told it exists by more than one person who was in that room, and every single one of them has told me the same detail, unprompted. That I stood there perfectly still for almost 90 seconds before I finally turned around. Sit with that for a second before I go any further. 90 seconds doesn't sound like very long when you say it out loud. Time it right now, if you want, count it in your head while you keep reading, and notice exactly how long 90 seconds becomes when the only thing happening is a room full of people watching you understand, in real time, that you've been left standing there. Tell me in the comments one word what you think you'd have done in those 90 seconds. Frozen, run, screamed. I've heard all 3 from people who have messaged me over the years, and I still don't fully know, even now, why I chose the 4th thing, which was simply to stand there and wait. Because some stubborn, humiliated part of me still believed, for those 90 seconds, that there was an explanation coming that would make this make sense. There wasn't one. My name is Odalise Marchetti. I'm 36 years old, and 8 years ago on the 9th of June, a man named Griffin Castlane did not show up to marry me. I need to take you back further than that day, though, because the wedding itself isn't really where this story starts. It starts almost 4 years earlier at a mutual friend's rooftop birthday party, where Griffin found me refilling my drink at a folding table and told me with total confidence that the wine I'd chosen was fine, but not what a night like this deserves, and then proceeded to spend 20 minutes explaining, unprompted, the difference between a fine wine and a night-appropriate wine in a way that should have annoyed me and somehow, instead, made me laugh so hard I nearly knocked the folding table over. That was Griffin in one sentence, if I'm honest with you now, years later, with the kind of clarity that only comes from a safe distance. He was charming in a way that felt like being chosen. He had opinions about everything, delivered with total certainty, and when he turned that certainty toward you, toward your career, your taste, your future, it felt less like being lectured and more like being seen. I didn't understand until much later that being seen and being managed can feel almost identical from the inside, especially if nobody in your life has ever shown you the difference. I grew up the oldest of 3 sisters, raised mostly by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and rarely had the bandwidth left over for the kind of attention I quietly craved. And I think, looking back, I walked into adulthood with a specific hunger that Griffin was unusually good at identifying and feeding, in small, careful portions, exactly enough to keep me leaning toward him and never quite full. The 3.5 years we dated before that wedding day were, from the outside, the kind of relationship people described as solid. Griffin worked in commercial real estate, successful, well-liked, the sort of man who remembered the names of restaurant hosts and left generous tips specifically where people could see him leave them. My friends adored him. My mother adored him even more, in a way that occasionally made me feel like the relationship existed slightly more for her benefit than mine, though I never let myself think that thought all the way through until much later. There was a night, maybe a year into dating him, when I got a small promotion at the marketing firm I worked for, my first real leadership title, and I came home practically vibrating with the news. And Griffin listened for exactly as long as it took him to find an opening, and then spent the rest of the evening telling me, gently, lovingly, that he just wanted to make sure I understood what a bigger role would mean for us, for our future plans, for the amount of time I'd realistically have for a wedding, for kids, for him. He never told me not to take it. He was too careful for that. He just made sure by the end of the night that I'd started quietly wondering whether I even wanted it as much as I had 3 hours earlier. Here's the part I don't say out loud very often. My own flaw in all of this is that I mistook being carefully managed for being deeply loved, for a very long time, because nobody in my life before Griffin had ever paid that much close attention to the details of me. It took losing something as public and devastating as that wedding day to finally understand that attention and love are not automatically the same thing, even though for years I genuinely could not tell the difference standing inside my own relationship. The wedding planning itself, in hindsight, should have told me everything. Griffin had opinions about the venue, the guest list, even the exact peonies in my bouquet, always delivered as helpful suggestions, always framed as him simply caring more than most grooms bothered to care. I remember my sister, Camille, pulling me aside about 2 months before the wedding, in a fitting room while I stood in my dress for an alteration appointment, and asking me carefully, gently, whether I felt like myself lately or whether I felt like a slightly quieter, more agreeable version of myself. I remember laughing it off. I remember telling her I was just stressed about wedding logistics. I think some part of me even then knew she wasn't entirely wrong and chose not to look at it directly, because looking at it directly 2 months out felt unbearable. The morning of the wedding itself was, up until 11:40, one of the happiest mornings of my life. My mother did my hair. Camille and my youngest sister, Beatrice, kept sneaking sips of champagne and getting scolded by the photographer for laughing too hard in the getting ready photos. I remember standing in front of a full-length mirror in that dress, feeling, for one clean, uncomplicated hour, entirely and simply happy, no undercurrent, no quiet management, just happy. Griffin's best man, a college friend of his named Desmond, found me at 11:40, pale, unable to quite meet my eyes, and told me Griffin needed a few minutes, that he was having some thoughts, and that I shouldn't worry. I want you to understand that I believed, for the next 40 minutes, standing in a small side room in my wedding dress while a string quartet played on the other side of a wall, that this was simply nerves. Grooms got nervous. I told myself that so many times in those 40 minutes that I nearly convinced myself it was true. It wasn't nerves. At 12:20, my mother came into that side room with a look on her face I had never seen on her before in 36 years of being her daughter, and told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that Griffin had left the building through a service entrance 20 minutes earlier, and that nobody, including his own parents, could reach him. I walked out to that aisle anyway. I want to explain why, because it still doesn't entirely make sense even to me, except that some part of me needed to see the empty space at the end of it with my own eyes before I could believe any of this was real. That's the 90 seconds I told you about at the start. That's what those 140 guests watched. I'm not going to spend a long time on what happened in the weeks immediately after, because I think most of you can imagine it well enough without me walking you through every detail, and some of it still isn't mine to share publicly, out of fairness to people who weren't the ones who did anything wrong. What I will tell you is that Griffin resurfaced 4 days later, not to me directly, but through a mutual friend, with a message that amounted to him having realized at the last possible minute that he wasn't ready, phrased in a way that somehow centered his own bravery in finally being honest with himself, as if the honesty couldn't have arrived at literally any other point across 3.5 years, except the one guaranteed to cause the most possible damage to me, publicly, in front of everyone I loved. I moved back in with my mother for 2 months after that, which felt, at 36, like an admission of failure I couldn't quite swallow, though I understand now it was simply the only reasonable thing to do. I canceled a lease I'd already broken to move in with Griffin after the wedding. I returned gifts. I had a conversation with a caterer about a partial refund that I still, to this day, cannot fully remember because I think some protective part of my brain simply declined to store it. There was a specific low point about 6 weeks after the wedding date when I sat on my mother's bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, still wearing clothes from 3 days earlier, and genuinely could not locate a single reason to get up off that floor. I'm telling you this not for sympathy, though I'll take it if you're offering, but because I think it matters for you to understand exactly how far down this went before anything started to turn, because the turning point I'm about to tell you about would mean nothing if you didn't understand the floor it was rising from. The turn, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. It was Camille, my sister, sitting down on that bathroom floor next to me at 2 in the morning, not saying anything wise or comforting, just sitting there in silence for almost 20 minutes before she finally said, quietly, "I've been wanting to tell you something for 2 months and I didn't know how, so I'm just going to say it badly. I don't think Griffin left you at the altar. I think he finally showed you who he'd always been, and you get to decide now whether you ever want to shrink yourself for someone like that again." I didn't feel healed hearing that. A lot of these stories skip straight to the healing part, and that's not how it actually works. What I felt for the first time in 6 weeks was slightly less alone on that floor. That was all. That was enough to get up. I want to ask you something here because I think about it a lot, and I think it matters for anyone watching who's been through something similar. Have you ever had a moment where someone didn't fix anything, didn't say anything particularly profound, and just sat with you in the worst part, and that alone was somehow the thing that got you moving again? If that's happened to you, tell me in the comments who that person was for you. I want to know because I think we don't say thank you to those people nearly often enough. The next several months were unglamorous in a way I think is important to actually say out loud, instead of skipping past toward the good part. I went to therapy for the first time in my life, with a woman named Priyanka Basu who spent our first several sessions mostly just asking me questions about my childhood that I didn't understand the relevance of until months later. I started running, badly, slowly, mostly just to have somewhere to put the specific restless anger that had nowhere else to go. I deleted, then reinstalled, then deleted again, every way Griffin could possibly contact me, 3 separate times before I finally made it stick. About 8 months after the wedding date, still very much not looking for anything, I went to a friend's dinner party mostly because Camille physically showed up at my apartment and refused to let me cancel. I sat reluctantly next to a man named Julian Ferreira, a structural engineer with an unremarkable job description and an extremely remarkable habit of actually listening to full sentences before responding to them, which after 3.5 years of Griffin, felt almost disorienting. I want to tell you honestly that I didn't fall for Julian that night, or even that month, because I think the version of this story where I meet the right person immediately and everything heals in a montage isn't true, and I'd rather tell you the real version. What actually happened is that Julian and I became, slowly over about 4 months, genuinely good friends. The kind where he'd text me articles about bridge engineering he found interesting for no reason except that he thought I might find them interesting too, and I'd text him back with questions. And neither of us treated any of it as leading toward anything because I genuinely wasn't ready for anything. And I told him that directly, early on, and he simply said, okay, and meant it. And never once made me feel like a project he was patiently waiting to complete. That, it turns out, was the entire difference. Griffin had always made me feel like a slightly unfinished version of someone he was helping shape into a better one. Julian made me feel like exactly who I already was on any given Tuesday was more than enough for him to want to keep showing up. There was a specific afternoon, about 5 months into our friendship, when I finally told Julian the full version of the wedding day, all of it, the 90 seconds, the service entrance, the message through a mutual friend, and I watched him listen to the entire thing without once interrupting to fix it or minimize it or tell me what Griffin's real problem must have been. When I finished, he just said, "That sounds like it was so lonely standing there." And I realized, sitting across from him, that in 8 months of processing this with therapists and sisters and well-meaning friends, nobody had used that specific word before, lonely, and it was somehow the exact right word. The one that finally let something in my chest unclench slightly. The relationship that eventually grew out of that friendship wasn't some fairy tale free of my own fear. It wasn't that simple. About a year into dating Julian, when things had started to feel serious, I had a full, quiet panic one evening, sitting in his car outside my apartment, convinced I was simply choosing to walk toward the exact same cliff a second time, just more slowly. I told him that out loud, shaking slightly, fully expecting him to either get defensive or leave. He didn't do either. He sat with me in that car for almost an hour, not arguing me out of the fear, just asking me questions about what specifically I was afraid of until I talked myself slowly back to solid ground, mostly on my own, with him simply staying present while I did it. This wasn't a single dramatic turning point the way the wedding day was, and it wouldn't be fair to make it sound like one. It was hundreds of small, unremarkable moments like that one, stacked on top of each other over almost 2 years. Each one quietly proving to some old, wounded part of me that this was a genuinely different shape of relationship than the one I'd nearly married into. Julian proposed 2 years after that dinner party on an entirely unremarkable Tuesday evening, in our own kitchen, no crowd, no string quartet, no audience of any kind except our dog, who was mostly interested in whether the ring box contained food. I said yes before he'd even fully finished the sentence, which he still teases me about gently to this day. We got married 11 months later in a small backyard ceremony, 30 guests instead of 140, and I want to tell you about that day specifically, because I think it matters as much as the first one did, maybe more. Camille stood beside me the entire morning, the way she had on that bathroom floor years earlier, and at one point, adjusting my hair, she said quietly, "You know you don't have to walk down any aisle today if any part of you isn't sure." And I remember laughing, actually laughing, and telling her I had never in my life been more certain of anything, and meaning it completely, with none of the quiet, managed uncertainty I hadn't even recognized as uncertainty the first time. I did walk down an aisle again. I want you to know that specifically, because I think it matters for anyone watching who's wondered whether something like this can ever fully heal, whether you can ever stand in that exact vulnerable position again without your whole body bracing for the doors to stay shut. Mine didn't stay shut. Julian was standing right there, visibly, openly emotional in a way Griffin, I realized somewhere in that ceremony, had never once let himself be around me, not fully, not without some careful, managed edge to it. I remember standing at the end of that aisle, actually thinking briefly and involuntarily of those original 90 seconds, the peonies shaking in my hands, the quartet playing too long. I let the thought pass through instead of pushing it away, the way Priyanka had taught me to do in therapy. And then I looked at Julian, actually looked at him, and the thought simply dissolved on its own, the way a lot of old fears do once you finally give them permission to just pass through instead of controlling you from somewhere underneath. I should say something about Griffin here too, because I don't want this to be a story that pretends the person who hurt you simply vanishes into a cartoon villain forever. I heard, secondhand, a few years after the wedding, that Griffin got married himself eventually to someone else, and I remember waiting to feel something enormous when I heard that news, and mostly feeling nothing at all, which surprised me more than anger would have. I think that quiet nothing, more than any dramatic confrontation I never got to have with him, was the actual proof that I'd healed. Not forgiveness exactly, just distance. Just the sense that his choices had finally stopped being load-bearing in my life. What I lost on that first wedding day isn't the kind of thing you can fully name in one sentence, and I'd rather sit with that than wrap it up too neatly. I lost a version of a future I'd built entire plans around. I lost, for a while, a fairly significant amount of trust in my own judgment, the ability to believe I could correctly read a person I'd spent 3.5 years with. That second loss took longer to get back than almost anything else, longer than the humiliation, longer than the grief over Griffin specifically. But I also think, if I'm honest with you now, sitting here 8 years past that aisle, that I got something back that I'm not sure I ever would have found if that door had opened the way it was supposed to. I got a genuinely accurate map of the difference between being managed and being loved, one I don't think I could have drawn before I'd lived both sides of it. I got Julian, specifically, a version of partnership that never once asked me to be smaller in order to be chosen. So maybe the real question isn't whether I'd go back and warn myself, standing at that first aisle, about what was coming. Maybe it's whether I'd even want to, knowing everything I know now about where the other side of that specific devastation eventually led. Here's something I think about more than I expected to, even now, happily married, years past all of it. For a long time I assumed that being left at the altar was simply the worst thing that had ever happened to me, full stop, no further nuance required. I've come to believe something a little more complicated instead, that it was the worst thing and also, somehow, in a way I couldn't possibly have seen from inside those 90 seconds. The exact door I needed slammed shut in order to eventually walk through a much better one. I don't say that to minimize what that day cost me. I say it because I think it's true, and because I think some of you watching are standing exactly where I was standing that day, and you deserve to hear that the door closing isn't always the end of the story, even when it feels in that exact moment like it absolutely is. I'll leave you with one more question, because I think it matters just as much as anything else I've told you tonight. If you're standing at your own version of that aisle right now, in whatever shape it takes for you, waiting for doors that might not open the way you're hoping, what would it take for you to finally turn around, walk back down that aisle yourself, and go looking for the version of love that never once asks you to shrink? Odalise and Griffin aren't real names, and the aisle in this story isn't a real address, but the pattern underneath it is one a lot of us carry quietly, without ever putting words to it. If any part of tonight found its way into something in your own life, I hope it gave you a little more to sit with than you had before you pressed play. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.